There's this lake that my brother and I used to fish. We'd use live bait, usually crickets or worms, and we'd catch a ton of bluegill. It was a fun time, and some of those early memories are the reason I've been such an avid fisherman for most of my life. The lake wasn't the most popular fishing spot, despite being pretty well stocked from what I can remember. I think most of the locals just found it inconvenient and inaccessible unless you were prepared to hike through the woods a bit, which my brother and I always were. The seclusion was actually one of my favorite things about it, almost like I was sharing a private activity that not everyone got to experience. Everyone knows the best lake fishing happens during periods of low light, meaning early morning or late evening. It's more customary to wake up at the crack of dawn and get out early, but my brother and I developed this habit of going out later in the day and staying into the night. It was our substitute for whatever most high school kids did at that time of night on the weekend, probably partying and whatnot. It was a Friday night, and everything was going according to plan. We reached the lake just as the sun started to set, and by the time we were all baited up, the sun was already starting to dip. We were positioned at the edge of the lake on this little formation of rocks that made a good comfortable surface for us and all our excess gear. It was something we had done hundreds of times. As we were fishing, though, something caught my eye on the far side of the lake. There was movement in the water, and by the sheer rippling of it, I was surprised it had taken me so long to notice. I pointed it out to JJ, and the two of us strained our eyes in confusion, wondering what was causing it. Keep in mind, this lake was pretty sizable, and when coupled with the low visibility, it wasn't like you could see perfectly clearly across it. But then, as we were both looking at the ripples in the water, something happened that I would have never expected, not in a million years. A dark mass started rising out of the water where the ripples had been, and as it emerged, my assumption that it had been a huge fish was immediately dispelled. It was not a fish. It was way too big and way too upright. There was only one explanation, really. I think my brother and I realized it at the same time, because I heard him curse at the same time I did. It was a person. Think about how strange that is on its own. Not only was there a literal person in this somewhat private lake after sunset, but they had just been submerged below the surface. And not just that, they must have been down there for quite some time too. Otherwise we would have noticed them earlier. It was freaky enough to quicken my heartbeat a little, and I got this compelling urge to leave. My brother didn't want to, though, saying that we had just gotten out there, and that person in the lake was too far away to have any kind of effect on us. I figured he wasn't wrong, so the two of us spent the next few minutes watching the person in the lake, trying to rationalize the sight. They were swaying back and forth rhythmically, almost hypnotically. Their movements weren't jerky or choppy, but perfectly fluid, like they were commanding the water around them as opposed to merely cutting through it. Our fishing poles were all but neglected at that point, lying there untouched while the two of us kept our attention fixated on the strange sight across the lake. Was it possible they were fishing? No, that seemed ridiculous. Fishing underwater? Unheard of. JJ suggested that maybe they were enjoying a night swim, which was plausible, until I grazed the surface of the lake with my hand and instantly recoiled at how cold it was. You'd have to be a psycho to enjoy swimming in temperatures that low. Without much else to do besides ignore them and keep fishing, I snapped out of my trance and encouraged my brother to do the same. But when I looked over at him, I realized that he was either much more invested or much more scared than I was, maybe both. Instead of heeding my advice, he sat there motionlessly with his lips slightly parted and his eyes glued to the lake. He wasn't even holding his fishing pole anymore. I said his name a few times in frustration before he finally averted his gaze, instinctively picking his fishing pole back up. With a little shake of his hand, he said sorry, and the two of us tried to resume fishing, although it was pretty clear that our attention was elsewhere. I'm not really sure what I expected to happen. I guess I figured that person would eventually get out of the lake, or notice us, or do something other than just stand there. After a few minutes of mindlessly casting and reeling, JJ tapped my shoulder and said, "Look." I looked back across the lake just in time to see that person submerge again, disappearing below the surface. I found myself staring at the spot they had just been, expecting them to reappear any second, but they didn't. A minute passed, and then another. It dawned on me that JJ had his phone out with a stopwatch running. As it ticked up past 2 minutes, I grew increasingly astonished at how long they were holding their breath. JJ theorized that maybe it was someone training, and I almost laughed at the thought of an Olympic diver testing their lung capacity out there, in a freezing cold lake in the middle of nowhere after the sun had set. Suddenly, the thought wasn't so funny anymore, and I started packing up, telling JJ we were leaving. But he held me back, saying he wanted to wait and see how long they could hold their breath for. I told him fine, but gathered up our stuff anyway, feeling that urge to leave start creeping back in. Just before the 3-minute mark, I noticed ripples in the water again. Only this time, they were much, much closer, 1/5 of the way out instead of all the way on the other side. The realization that this person had not only held their breath for nearly 3 minutes, but had done so while swimming was enough for me to raise my voice at JJ. This time he didn't argue, and the two of us stood up, preparing to leave. But we couldn't go just yet. The curiosity was far too strong. JJ and I watched as the person started emerging again, and this time we could see them clear as day. To my utter surprise, it was actually a woman, not a man like I had anticipated. She had long brown hair and was wearing what looked like a dark green swimsuit. And there was one more thing I need to mention. She was kind of beautiful. She didn't look much older than we were, maybe a year or two if I had to guess. The moment I saw her, I instantly felt less intimidated, less scared too. I started wondering if maybe my brother and I had been too hasty with our intention to leave. The two of us were still frozen in place though, and she was actually the one who broke the silence. She flashed an alluring smile and said, "Hi," almost like she was trying to be playful and coy, like she hadn't just held her breath for 3 minutes while swimming through a freezing cold lake. She was definitely a strong swimmer. It was obvious from the way she bobbed around, seeming just as comfortable in the water as most people would on land. I was dumbfounded, too perplexed to speak, but my brother blurted out the question I was dying to ask. He asked her what she was doing, and I had to remind myself that she was behaving like a crazy person, as harmless as she looked. She leaned her head back and said she was swimming. My brother said, "Well, yeah, obviously," then asked her if she was training for something. She gave us another teasing smile and said something like that, then glided a little closer to us. Then she actually asked us if we wanted to join her. Pure insanity. I spoke up for the first time, asking her if she was crazy and telling her the water was freezing. She laughed and called us bits, then said we'd get used to the temperature fast. JJ said no, and she started glaring at us with a finger on her lip like she was thinking. I don't know if it was her cavalier attitude or the icy look in her eye, but the alarm bell started ringing, and I was terrified all over again. There were so many things I wanted to ask her. Who was she? Was she alone? How long had she been out there? Did she live nearby? But I didn't. Instead, I just grabbed JJ's shoulder and told the pretty lake girl we were leaving. I'm not sure what I was expecting her to do, but I definitely wasn't expecting her to start screaming. She screamed no at the top of her lungs, and I stumbled backwards out of pure shock. My brother and I made sure we weren't leaving any of our stuff behind and then started running away from the lake. She kept screaming after us, though. She was yelling for us to come back and get in the water. As if that wasn't horrifying enough, she just started shrieking at one point. Not words, just shrieking. It sounded like someone being stabbed. I could still hear her behind us by the time we were halfway back to the car. Part of me was expecting her to get out of the water and start chasing us, but I don't know if she ever did. By the time we made it back to the car, JJ already had the police on the line. He told them what had happened, and even though they asked us to stay nearby so they could question us, he told them he didn't feel comfortable doing that, then hung up. I probably would have done the same thing. That's how badly I wanted to get out of there. You might think the experience would have discouraged my brother and I from continuing to fish there, and it did, but only for a while. We actually did go back a fair amount, though for the first handful of outings we made sure to bring our dad with us. It took some convincing to get him to believe us, but he ultimately did. He was pretty curious and wanted to see this strange girl for himself, but we never saw her again. For all we knew, the police had found her and dealt with her however they decided to. It became somewhat of a shared joke between my brother and I. It actually got to a point where every time we fished that lake, a little part of us wanted to see her again. But now that more times passed, and that lake is no longer part of my life, I'd begun to recognize the strangeness and horror of it all. She was probably just mentally ill. That's the explanation I ultimately decided on. My brother has some interesting theories of his own, but I find them all silly and unrealistic. Either way, I doubt anything as unexplainable and as strange as what happened that night will ever happen to me again. My name's Jay, and fishing is one of life's greatest pleasures. I take every opportunity I can to get out on the water, whether it's a lake, river, or the marshes down here in Louisiana. This happened about 2 months ago, when I was out with my friend Angel, who's just as obsessed with fishing as I am. We decided to go marsh fishing for speckled trout, something we'd done plenty of times before. The marshes around here are pretty shallow, so we took out my 2-person kayak like we always do. It was early spring, so it was still pretty cold outside, and the water was even colder, but we didn't care. We'd been paddling for about 30 minutes when we found a good spot that looked promising. The marsh seemed completely empty that day, no other fishermen around, which was exactly how we liked it. We cracked open a couple of beers and got right to the fishing, just enjoying the peace and quiet. We'd been fishing for maybe an hour when Angel hooked something decent, at least from the looks of it. As he was reeling it in, he got a little too excited and leaned over the side of the kayak to get a better angle. I knew what was about to happen the second before it did, but I couldn't speak up in time. As he was leaning over, I watched helplessly as his phone slid out of his jacket pocket and plunged into the muddy water. Safe to say, Angel was frustrated as hell. He said he had insurance that would cover damage to his phone, but not if it was completely lost. He said the replacement would cost several $100s that he didn't have, and I didn't fault him for it one bit. I'm not exactly drowning in cash myself. I told him we'd try to find it, even though the water was so murky you couldn't see more than a few inches down. We spent the next 20 minutes in that same area using our paddles to try and feel something hard on the bottom, but it was hopeless. The marsh bottom was all mud and vegetation, and even though both of us had seen the phone fall into the water, we started second-guessing where we should even be looking. Finally, I told Angel we weren't going to find it and we might as well try to salvage some enjoyment from the day. But he shook his head and said he wasn't leaving without that phone. Before I could stop him, Angel started taking off his shoes and pants. He said he was going to wade into the marsh and try to feel around for the phone with his feet. I thought it wasn't a half-bad idea, actually. At least it was better than poking around with paddles. The moment Angel stepped into the water, he let out a string of curses about how cold it was. That spot of the marsh was actually deeper than I'd expected. About 4.5 feet, judging by where the water came up on Angel's body. But he was determined, so he started feeling around with his feet in the area where he thought his phone had dropped. I watched from the kayak, getting more impatient by the minute. The water was so cold that I knew Angel couldn't stand there for much longer, and I was hoping he'd either find the phone quickly or give up and get back on the kayak. But then, out of nowhere, Angel yelled out and his whole body flipped forward. 1 second he was standing upright in the water, and the next second he was completely submerged. At first I thought maybe he'd slipped on the muddy bottom, or maybe he'd actually found his phone and dove down to grab it. But after a few seconds passed without Angel resurfacing, I realized something was seriously wrong. I didn't even think. I just started yanking off my shoes and jacket, preparing to jump in after him. Before I could get in the water, though, Angel burst up from the marsh, covered head to toe in filthy muck and mud, and he was screaming at me to get out of there as fast as possible. I helped pull him back into the kayak, and we started paddling away from that spot as quickly as we could. Angel was shaking, and not just from the cold water by the looks of it. He kept looking back over his shoulder at the water like he expected something to follow us. Once we were a decent distance away, I asked him what had happened down there. Angel said that while he was feeling around for the phone with his feet, something had grabbed his ankle and yanked him under. He had a hard time describing what it felt like. He said it wasn't exactly a hand, but it wasn't a tentacle or a set of teeth either. Just something that wrapped around his ankle with incredible strength. According to Angel, after he went under, whatever had grabbed him tried to drag him away from where we had been fishing. He said he fought against it with everything he had, kicking and struggling, until he finally managed to break free from its grip. We called it a day and headed back to the boat launch, despite Angel not having found his phone. But that clearly wasn't what was on his mind. The whole ride back, he barely said a word. I kept trying to convince him that maybe it had been a big catfish or an alligator gar that had grabbed him. But at the end of the day, I hadn't been the one to feel it, so I couldn't exactly convince him of anything. Angel insisted that what grabbed him didn't feel like any fish or animal he'd ever encountered. He was so unsettled and manic that I honestly started to feel spooked myself. I mean, what could that thing have been? My mind started wandering, and it didn't lead me anywhere good. I've been fishing those marshes for years, and I've never experienced anything like what Angel described. Even after doing a bunch of research online, I was never able to find anything conclusive. Part of me wants to go back to that spot and see if we could figure out what's down there, but I'm not eager to do that anytime soon. I will say that every time I've been marsh fishing since then, I felt this sense of unease that should never accompany something as enjoyable as fishing. This story happened about 2 months ago, and it's something I still think about from time to time. It was me, Kat, Nick, and Megan, the usual crew for weekend adventures. We'd been looking for something to do on a Saturday evening, and Nick brought up this reservoir near Megan's house that we'd been to several times before. It's kind of a classic spot amongst our friend group. Nick and I knew it was stocked with bass, so we were eager to get some fishing in since the two of us are pretty obsessed with the activity. Kat and Megan were just excited to drink a little at the water's edge and maybe go for a dip if they were feeling adventurous enough. Megan's house is way out in the sticks, and the reservoir is maybe a 10-minute drive away, followed by a short walk through some woods behind her neighborhood. It's technically county property, which is obvious from the many no trespassing signs posted every few yards along the chain-link fence that surrounds it, but Megan had cut a hole in the fence ages ago. We laughed about it every time we went there, joking about how we'd found this perfect hidden spot that nobody else knew about. The reservoir itself is pretty small. It's surrounded by thick woods on 3 sides and a small access road on the 4th. The water's crystal clear, and there's this little sandy area where we usually set up. We call it the beach because of the sand and the fact that there are some flat rocks perfect for lounging on. It really is a nice spot, and since it's so secluded, we can blast music and be rowdy without worrying about disturbing anyone. The sun was already going down by the time we made it through the fence. Nick and I immediately started setting up our fishing gear, even though we both knew we probably wouldn't be doing much fishing. The girls spread out a blanket and got right to the drinking. It was a vibe, especially since I had a little thing for Megan, and Nick for Kat. As the girls were debating going for a little dip, Kat pointed something out that none of us had noticed before. She was squinting down the bank, asking if we saw that canoe over there. We all looked in the direction she was pointing. Sure enough, a little ways down the shoreline was a canoe wedged into some reeds near the edge of the water. It was positioned oddly, like it had just drifted there without being tied off properly. The weird thing was, we'd been to the reservoir dozens of times over the past year alone, and none of us had ever seen a canoe there before. Nick and I are both pretty curious by nature, and the canoe was close enough that we figured we might as well go check it out. The girl seems more interested in their music and drinks, so they waved us off when we said we're gonna investigate. The walk along the bank took maybe 3 minutes. As we approached the canoe, I realized something was wrong. It wasn't just an empty canoe. It looked like someone had been using it recently and then just left. Like there was a fishing rod with its line still dangling into the water, alongside a tackle box lying open like someone had been digging through it. That wasn't the only thing. There was a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in plastic sitting on the seat. But the strangest thing by far was the phone. It was sitting right there on the main seat, locked but with the flashlight on. I pointed it out to Nick, asking who just leaves their phone behind like that. Nick shrugged, but I could tell he was thinking the same thing I was. All the other stuff, the fishing gear, even the sandwich, could be explained easily. Maybe someone had heard us coming, knew they were trespassing, and took off before they could get caught. But leaving behind a perfectly good cell phone, that's not something any rational person does, no matter how scared they are. I looked at Nick and then back at the canoe, taking everything in at once. I know it doesn't sound super creepy, but in the moment, it was one of the creepiest things I'd ever seen. If you were there, you would have felt the same. There was still enough light out that we should have been able to see whoever the canoe belonged to if they were anywhere nearby. We looked around the immediate area, but there was no one there. Nick said it was weird, and I agreed completely. The two of us headed back to the girls and told them what we found. The more I described the contents of the canoe, the more unsettled I felt. I remember looking back over at it, feeling this rising feeling of foreboding as I watched it gently drift back and forth in the water. The four of us talked it over for a few minutes, throwing around theories, but none of our explanations really made sense when you factored in the phone. Kat said she wanted to get out of there, and honestly, I agreed. The whole situation was giving me a bad feeling. We started packing up our stuff when Megan gasped and pointed across the reservoir. I followed her gaze and literally had to do a double take. On the far side of the water was a person standing knee-deep in the reservoir. Even though the sun had just set, I could see them clearly. They had something long in their hands that looked like it could have been a fishing rod or maybe a stick. But what really freaked me out was the fact that they were just standing there perfectly still, facing in our direction. It dawned on me that they were watching us, and they probably had been for a while. All of a sudden, the creepiness of having seen that abandoned canoe turned into straight-up fear. None of us said it out loud, but I could tell we were all thinking the same thing. We needed to get out of there immediately. We grabbed our stuff and started heading back toward the fence. We weren't quite running, but we were moving fast. And then came the thing I had been dreading. That guy started yelling after us, screaming that we shouldn't be there and to get out. That's exactly what we were doing, but he didn't seem to care. He was belligerent, and the way he kept screaming and cursing made him sound like a lunatic. I didn't think it could get much worse than that, but I turned around just in time to see him drop whatever he'd been holding and start moving into deeper water. It took me 2 seconds to realize what was happening. He was swimming across the reservoir. I screamed at my friends to run, and we took off. We sprinted back to the hole in the fence and squeezed through as best as we could. I was in the back, and as I was crawling through, I could hear splashing from the direction of the water. I made it through, and the four of us booked it in the car and sped out of there as quickly as we could. For the next 20 minutes, we sat in Megan's driveway trying to make sense of what had happened. Kat was really shaken up, and Nick was trying to calm her down, but it didn't look like it was working. She was practically in tears, and I couldn't blame her. I was still pretty freaked out myself. None of us knew what to think. I wondered if that person screaming at us had been the owner of the canoe, and if so, why was their canoe all the way across the reservoir? And why were they in the reservoir in the first place? Or, and this is the one that really got to me, had that person done something to whoever the canoe belonged to? But, as Megan pointed out, that didn't make much sense considering the fact that they chased us, drawing unnecessary attention to themselves. Kat wanted to call the police, but what would we tell them? That we were trespassing and found an abandoned canoe? That someone yelled at us to get out of a place we weren't supposed to be in the first place? Not an option. It's been a few months since the incident, and we haven't been back to the reservoir since then. Part of me wants to go back there for answers, but I haven't been able to convince the girls, or even Nick, to come with me. It's probably for the best. I don't think I'm gonna forget about how creepy the whole thing was anytime soon, though.